They're not going to look for them. Trust me, nobody ever does. That's what a man was heard whispering just before a white van disappeared into the darkness of Route 22. Hours later, the same van was found, flipped on its side, and abandoned, in a quiet, desolate stretch of road. But what was inside would send shockwaves through the town and beyond. 12 young black girls, all lifeless, discarded like forgotten cargo, no IDs, no belongings, no one even knew their names. Local cops assumed it was some sort of drug deal gone wrong. A missing persons case, perhaps. But as they combed through the wreckage, they realized they had stumbled onto something far darker. This wasn't just a crash. This was a crime that had been hiding in plain sight, and what they found next was unimaginable. A system built to erase these girls, to make sure no one was ever looking for them in the first place. The van was found on a lonely stretch of Route 22, a winding road that passed through dense woods and abandoned farmsteads. It lay on its side, its metal frame crumpled and battered, wheels still spinning slowly as if time itself had been caught in the wreckage. The silence around it was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of insects and the soft rustling of the trees in the summer breeze. The crash was reported just after 3 a.m. by a lone trucker who had spotted the van's twisted body. From the road, he hadn't seen the wreck happen, but the scene before him made it clear something had gone horribly wrong. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the eerie calm that followed a crash of this magnitude. When the first responders arrived, they didn't know what to expect, but what they found would shake their very understanding of what they thought they knew about missing people. 12 young black girls were scattered across the shoulder of the road, lifeless, no pulse, no breath, no sound. They lay sprawled across the gravel, some tangled in the long grass, others twisted at odd angles as though they'd been tossed aside like broken dolls. The van, its back doors flung open, told a story without words. Inside, the mess was even worse. A filthy mattress, stained with something that couldn't be identified, sat on the cold metal floor, surrounded by scattered zip ties and empty syringes. The air was thick with a stench of something stale and unclean, something that felt far too familiar for the small town in Georgia. This wasn't just a traffic accident. The authorities had nothing to go on. No identification, no personal belongings, no cell phones, no wallets, nothing to indicate who these girls were, where they were from, or why they were traveling together in a van that seemed to have no destination. No records matched their descriptions. No reports had been filed. No one had been looking for them. The mystery was deepening by the hour. Local police thought it might be a drug run gone wrong or a botched trafficking bust, but even they weren't sure. There were no signs of forced entry or physical trauma that could explain the cause of death. Their bodies weren't bruised, yet they were cold to the touch. As the first responders worked tirelessly to gather evidence and search for clues, they were left with more questions than answers. What had happened, and more importantly, why wasn't anyone looking for them? The coroner's office later confirmed that the girls had died from something far more insidious than the crash. But the real shock came later when the victims' names were revealed. These weren't random girls. They weren't just missing teens from a nearby town. They were victims of a system that had been silently ignoring them for years. A system that had made their disappearance so easy to erase. The tragedy was that nobody had even noticed they were gone. The local community was in disbelief. These weren't just statistics. They weren't just victims of circumstance. These were daughters, nieces, students, friends. The tragedy of it all was that no one had noticed. There had been no Amber Alerts for them, no missing person reports that made headlines. For most of these girls, their disappearances had gone unnoticed, their names unspoken, their lives unmissed. The realization was painful. These girls were invisible. To the system, to society, and to those who should have protected them. The van crash didn't just unearth bodies, it unearthed the very truth of what it means to be neglected by the world. These girls had been left to fade into the background, ignored by the system that was supposed to protect them, silenced by a society that had already decided they didn't matter. The grief was palpable. Families, already grappling with the loss of their loved ones, now faced the crushing truth that their daughters had been lost long before they were found. There was no record of them anywhere. No one had noticed they were gone. No one had cared to ask. The community, still reeling from the discovery of the crash, began to turn its focus inward. How could this have happened? Why did it take something this horrific for anyone to notice? And yet, As the investigation began, the details that emerged only deepened the mystery. There was no sign of the driver, just an empty, wrecked van. No evidence of foul play from other vehicles or pedestrians. Just the cold, hard fact that these girls had been found in a place where they shouldn't have been, in a way that shouldn't have happened. But still, the authorities couldn't even begin to figure out how or why they'd ended up there. What the officers knew was simple. There had been a crash, and 12 lives had ended too soon. They had no names, no connection to the community, and no paper trail leading back to where they came from. The silence surrounding them was deafening. But the more the police dug, the more unsettling the discovery became. As investigators combed through the wreckage of the van, looking for clues, one small detail struck them like a lightning bolt. In the glove compartment, they found a small piece of paper, handwritten list with 12 names, just first names, no last names. Each name was followed by a number, and next to that list, a faded tally, written in what looked like the same handwriting. The significance of it was immediately apparent. These weren't random victims. This wasn't just an isolated incident. These names were being kept track of like merchandise, as though these girls had been marked and catalogued for some larger purpose. The first responders, the police officers, the investigators, they were all left to wonder, who were these girls? Why were they here? Why had no one noticed that they were missing? And what kind of operation had left them discarded like this? The town, still grappling with the shock of the discovery, had already begun to ask hard questions. And as the weeks passed, the investigation unfolded like a twisted tale of corruption and abuse. It wasn't just a traffic accident. It was a case of human trafficking, a story about exploitation, and about how easy it was for some people to fall through the cracks, to disappear without anyone noticing. But even more chilling than the discovery itself was the haunting realization that this wasn't an isolated case. This wasn't the first time these girls had been left to be forgotten. They had slipped through the cracks of the system, passed from place to place like pawns in a larger game. The crash on Route 22 had revealed something much darker, a system that allowed these girls to disappear without a trace, and a world that didn't care enough to stop it. As the investigation continued, the truth became even more disturbing. Local authorities, overwhelmed and under-resourced, had never taken these disappearances seriously. In fact, many of the victims had already been reported missing by their families months earlier, but their cases had been closed quickly, dismissed as runaways or troubled girls. The system had decided they didn't matter. The fact that they were never found, that their stories were never told, was the harshest reality of all. The tragedy wasn't just that these girls had died, it was that their lives hadn't been valued enough to be saved. And that silence, the one that allowed them to vanish in the first place, had only been broken by the brutal crash that exposed it all. This wasn't just about a wreck on a lonely road. It was about the lives that had been swept under the rug for too long. And as the investigation gained national attention, the one question everyone kept asking was, how many others were out there? How many more girls had disappeared, unnoticed, never to be found? The town would never be the same. The families would never heal. And the world, if it was ever willing to listen, would have to face the painful truth that in the shadows, beneath the surface, these girls had been left to die, forgotten, until the crash forced the truth into the light. The van, flipped onto its side like an abandoned wreck, was barely visible from the road. The headlights had long since gone out, leaving only the faint outline of the twisted frame to guide the first responders toward it. The road was eerily quiet, just the sound of distant wind and rustling leaves. It was almost as if the land itself was holding its breath. There were no skid marks leading to the crash, no indication that anyone had tried to brake or swerve to avoid what had come. The first responders arrived in unmarked cars and fire trucks, their red and blue lights flashing against the dark trees, casting long shadows over the empty road. They didn't know what they were walking into, but they knew it was bad. What they found, though, was beyond comprehension. The van's back doors hung open, swaying gently in the still night air. It was impossible not to notice the scene that lay before them: 12 bodies, all girls, scattered across the side of the road. At first glance, they looked like discarded trash, carelessly thrown out of the van. But as the emergency lights flickered across their faces, the grim reality set in. These weren't just random bodies, these were people. Young lives violently taken and left behind like they meant nothing. The first responders stepped back, some in disbelief, others in shock. One of the EMTs knelt by the closest body, a teenage girl with a thin, torn jacket. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no life left behind them. The others, similarly lifeless, were strewn around her, some twisted in unnatural positions, others lying flat on their backs, their arms outstretched as if reaching for something. All of them were black girls, barely teens, no older than 16 or 17. "Who are they?" one of the firemen whispered under his breath, barely able to comprehend the sight, but no one had an answer. The van's back was cold, and so were the girls' bodies. No pulse, no breath, just lifeless, discarded in the grass like it didn't matter at all. The shock was palpable. This wasn't just a crash, it was something much darker, something planned. The responders looked at each other with quiet, apprehensive expressions, unsure of what to do. There were no signs of trauma or obvious injury. No blood spilt across the road. Nothing that immediately indicated a violent crash. It looked like the van had simply stopped, emptied out its passengers, and then left. But there was no sign of the driver. No footprints leading away from the scene. No blood trail. Just the lifeless bodies of 12 young girls who had never had a chance. That, as the first responders moved closer to the van, the confusion grew. Who were they? Why were they here? Why had they been left like this? And most troubling of all, why had no one come looking for them? The inside of the van was cold and barren, a stark contrast to the bodies scattered across the road. It wasn't a typical vehicle. There were no seats, no comfort, just a metal floor and a filthy, torn mattress bolted down in the middle. The mattress was stained with something, probably blood, and the corners were frayed and torn. This was not the kind of van someone would use for a road trip or a family outing. This was something else entirely. One of the deputies carefully moved to the front, opened the driver's side door, and peered inside. The front of the van was no different from the back. No IDs, no driver. It was as if the van had just been left there in the middle of nowhere, abandoned by the very people who had put those girls inside. The silence around them grew heavier as they slowly began to piece the scene together. It wasn't until the detective arrived with his team that the first clue emerged. In the glove compartment, tucked under a crumpled piece of paper, was a small list. It wasn't formal or organized, just a handful of first names written in pencil. Tasha, Kim, Ray, Bree, Jada. No last names, just the simple identification of someone who had been keeping track of them. The names weren't even written in any particular order, just jumbled, as though someone had quickly jotted them down without much thought. But the worst part was that each name had a number next to it. A tally, like a record of inventory. "Are these the victims?" one of the officers asked, but there was no answer. The names, simple and incomplete, spoke volumes. These weren't just missing girls. These were girls that someone had been keeping track of, like merchandise, like objects. They were listed and numbered, treated like an item on a warehouse shelf. "Where's the driver?" one of the other responders asked, his voice laced with confusion and suspicion. The officers searched the area, looking for any clues that might explain the cause of the crash or the whereabouts of the driver. The victims' bodies, however, gave them nothing more than their age and gender. No identification, no belongings, just a scene that didn't seem to make sense. The autopsies would reveal something chilling, something that would shake the town to its core. But right now, the silence in the air was the worst thing. The silence of not knowing who they were, the silence of no one caring until now, and the worst part, the silence of the system that had let them slip through the cracks in the first place. These were girls who had disappeared, and no one had bothered to look for them. Until now. One of the officers found an old coat tucked beneath one of the bodies. It was a cheap, worn jacket with frayed sleeves, and inside the pockets was nothing. No wallet, no phone, nothing to link her to a place or a family. Another body was found with a torn shirt, its hem bloody and stained. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no signs of struggle, but there was something wrong here. Something wasn't adding up, and that's when the investigators began to realize it. Some of the girls had been restrained. Their wrists were red, swollen, and bruised, as though they had been bound. The zip ties found on the floor of the van weren't just there by accident. They had been used to keep these girls in place, to make sure they didn't fight back, to make sure they didn't escape. The syringes scattered across the floor of the van made it clear this wasn't just an accident. The more they looked, the more it became apparent. This was no mere crash. This was a calculated effort. An effort to move these girls without anyone noticing, to erase them from existence. They had been drugged, restrained, and transported like cargo. "We need to get this out to the press," one of the officers muttered to the detective standing beside him. "These girls have families. Someone is missing them." But that, too, was the problem. No one had reported them missing. Not a single missing persons report had been filed for these girls. No Amber Alerts, no headlines. No one had even noticed they were gone. They had simply slipped through the cracks of the system, their disappearances ignored and forgotten, until they ended up in the back of that van. The authorities began to piece together a grim picture. These weren't just missing girls. These were girls who had been targeted. They were picked up, moved, and abandoned in a remote area, left to die. The list of names, the zip ties, the syringes, it was all part of a system that had been operating right under their noses. And now, it was too late to save them. As the first responders worked their way through the wreckage, one of them stopped cold. Something caught his eye in the van's back corner. Another list, this one longer, more detailed, more organized. A piece of paper with dates next to each name, each one crossed out with a thick black line. The numbers beside the names seemed to indicate something more than just a tally. It was a record of lives taken, a record of people who had been erased from existence. The discovery was the first of many to come, but it wouldn't be enough. The real horror was yet to be revealed, and as the investigation deepened, the truth would unravel, piece by piece, until they found themselves staring into the heart of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Though morning after the bodies were discovered, the crash site on Route 22 had become a media circus. News trucks and helicopters buzzed overhead as local law enforcement struggled to maintain control over the scene. What had started as a routine call about an accident had now spiraled into a full-scale investigation that no one was prepared for. The first responders had done their job, but the real work began the moment the bodies were collected and taken to the morgue. Investigators pored over the wrecked van, searching for clues. But the more they examined the scene, the more the situation seemed staged. The crash itself didn't make sense. No skid marks, no signs of evasive maneuvering, nothing to indicate the driver had tried to avoid the accident. The van had simply rolled over, like it had been left there intentionally. There was no crash debris scattered on the road, no broken glass, nothing that pointed to a high-speed collision. It wasn't a typical accident. It was too clean, too controlled. Whoever had crashed the van had done so with an end goal in mind, and that goal wasn't an accident. As authorities combed through the wreckage, they started finding disturbing clues, ones that raised more questions than they could answer. The interior of the van was cold and mechanical, not designed to transport people in any normal way. There was nothing resembling safety, no seats, no seatbelts, just cold metal walls and a thin, dirty mattress bolted to the floor. It wasn't a vehicle, it was a prison on wheels, a holding space for something or someone until the time came to dispose of them. In the glove compartment, investigators found a small piece of paper, folded and tucked under a packet of receipts. It wasn't a list of items or groceries, but a list of names. Names like Tasha, Kim, Bree, and Jada, each accompanied by a number. Just first names, no last names, no addresses. It was barely legible, but it was the first lead they had. A list, 12 names, 12 girls. But as the investigators turned the piece of paper over, another unsettling detail caught their eye. The numbers next to the names weren't random. They appeared to be organized, as if someone was keeping track of these girls in some grim inventory. Some names were scratched out, others circled in red, but none of them were complete. No last names, no phone numbers, no indication of where they were from or where they were going. It was like the list was meant to be hidden, kept out of view, just as these girls had been. "This isn't just a case of missing persons," one detective said, looking at the list, a grim realization dawning. "This is organized, and whoever's behind this is running a system." The questions started piling up immediately. Who are these girls? Where did they come from? Why were they traveling together? And most importantly, why had no one reported them missing? The victims were young, no older than 16, and they all appeared to be black. Their age, their race, and the sheer number of them raised alarm bells. What kind of operation could involve 12 girls who were seemingly erased from existence? They weren't just overlooked by their families. No one had been looking for them. Local police began reaching out to nearby counties, running names through their systems, and scanning old missing persons reports, but there was nothing. No one had filed a report for any of these girls. No Amber Alerts, no investigations. It was as if they had simply vanished from the world, unnoticed by everyone except their families who had tried to report them missing, only to be met with indifference. A few names popped up in connection, 2 past reports, but they were old cases that had been closed. One of the girls had been listed as a runaway. Another had been marked as a higher-risk missing person, but the case had been closed within a week. One victim had a criminal record, a petty theft charge, nothing major. Another had a history of mental health struggles. In a few cases, the girls had been known to frequent shelters or foster care homes, but no one seemed to be looking for them. No one was asking the right questions. Frustration built up quickly in the investigation. The local police were overwhelmed, and the few leads they had only raised more questions. Who was responsible for this? How had these girls disappeared without a trace? And who was behind the van that had left them all to die on the side of a desolate highway? Within days, the case was handed over to the FBI. Local authorities, though well-meaning, had hit a wall. The scale of the operation was too big, too systemic. The feds, with their resources and experience, were in a much better position to track down leads, dig into financials, and connect the dots that the locals had missed. The FBI agents on the case arrived with a sense of urgency. This wasn't just a local case anymore. This was something much bigger, trafficking operation hidden in plain sight. There was no immediate suspect, no obvious criminal figure that investigators could point to. But the moment the FBI dug into the girls' histories and the pattern of their disappearances, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a horrifying way. Each victim had vanished in a different way, some from shelters, others from foster care homes or hospitals. One had even gone missing from a halfway house. All of them were linked by their vulnerability, girls who had slipped through the cracks of the system. The authorities had dismissed their disappearances, marked them as runaways, unstable, or difficult. In other words, these were girls who didn't matter. They were invisible to the world, and whoever was behind this knew it. It wasn't just the victims who had been erased. It was the system itself, which had turned a blind eye to them. The authorities weren't looking for these girls. No one had cared enough to ask why they were missing in the first place. But now, the investigation had gone too far to ignore. The FBI agents were pulling in data from local hospitals, shelters, and jails. They were looking for common threads, patterns in the disappearances, anything that could link these girls to the same operation. But each lead seemed to point to a much larger conspiracy. This wasn't just a rogue trafficking ring run by a few individuals. It was a network, a system that spanned counties, states, and even nations. It was the kind of operation that could only be hidden for so long before it was exposed. That as they dug deeper into the wrecked van, the investigators discovered even more unsettling clues. There were traces of narcotics in the girls' systems, likely sedatives used to subdue them during transport. And as they reviewed the financial transactions connected to the shell companies that seemed to run the operation, they uncovered large transfers of money to international accounts, payments made in exchange for people, not goods. The FBI agents were up against something far larger than anyone had anticipated. These girls were not random victims of chance. They had been chosen because they were easy to overlook, easy to erase. Their lives hadn't mattered enough for anyone to notice they were gone until it was too late. The sense of dread grew as they uncovered more details: burner phones, fake addresses, altered records, everything designed to keep the operation hidden from prying eyes. The deeper they dug, the more they realized how carefully this system had been constructed. Every step of the operation had been carefully planned. There was no room for mistakes. And the worst part, it was operating right under their noses. As investigators compiled the evidence, they could see the outlines of a much larger problem. A network of people, operating in plain sight, feeding off the most vulnerable members of society. Girls who had no family left, no resources, no one to miss them when they disappeared. These were the girls no one cared about. And now, the investigation had moved from being a simple case of missing persons to a national crisis. The police had already lost precious time, but the feds weren't going to let this go. They couldn't afford to. Lives had already been lost, and they had no intention of letting more disappear in silence. The investigation had taken a chilling turn as federal agents pored over the wreckage of the van, piecing together the broken trail of clues. One thing was becoming clear: this wasn't some random, isolated case. The operation was bigger than anyone had anticipated, more insidious than they could have imagined. And yet, the answer had been waiting in the shadows, just out of reach. It wasn't until an anonymous call from someone who had worked inside the operation itself that the truth finally began to surface. Keon had been a maintenance worker at one of the facilities connected to the traffickers. It wasn't much more than a run-down warehouse in an industrial part of town, just another nondescript building among many. But Keon knew something was off from the very first day he was hired. He had been given simple instructions: keep the lights on, move the supplies, take orders from whoever was in charge that night. At first, it all seemed harmless. He was just doing a job, trying to make ends meet. But the longer Keon worked there, the more uneasy he felt. The building wasn't a typical warehouse. The workers were always in a hurry, moving things around in silence, never talking much. The managers never seemed to stick around, always arriving in the dead of night and leaving before dawn. Orders came through encrypted messages, brief and impersonal. No one asked questions, and no one talked. The workers moved in and out like machines, performing tasks without question. It wasn't a company. It was a system that Keon had unwittingly become a part of. It wasn't until a few months into his job that Keon began to understand the true nature of what was happening behind those closed doors. One night, as he cleaned up after a van had left, he overheard a conversation between two men in the loading dock. They were talking about the girls who had been brought in, and it wasn't just about them being transported for some unknown reason. No one's looking for them girls, one man had said with a laugh. That's why it works. Keon froze. The words struck him like a blow to the gut. The girls weren't just being moved, they were being erased. The next few weeks were a blur of confusion and unease. Keon hadn't understood the full scope of what was happening at first. He'd seen the girls being brought in, but he didn't know why. Some were barely conscious, others seemed disoriented, drugged, or restrained. They were brought in and out under the cover of darkness, always in silence, and always there was a cold efficiency to the whole operation, like the movement of products, not people. Keon had been asked to do little more than maintain the building, but the more he saw, the more disgusted he became. He realized these weren't just people being trafficked, they were human cargo. They were brought in, drugged, restrained, and shipped off to somewhere Keon couldn't imagine. They never came back. He never saw them again. But it wasn't until that overheard conversation that the true horror of what was happening truly set in. These girls, these young women, weren't just victims of circumstance. They were victims of a system designed to make them disappear. No one cared about them. They were invisible. And that's exactly how the operation worked. The girls were chosen because no one would miss them. They were picked up from shelters, from foster care homes, from hospitals, places where they should have been protected, and then taken to a place where their very identities were erased. Keon had tried to ignore the guilt gnawing at him. He had tried to convince himself that he was just a worker, that he had no control over what was happening. But as the months went on, the weight of his complicity grew heavier. He had seen the faces of those girls. He had heard their muffled cries as they were ushered into the van, their eyes wide with fear. And yet, he had done nothing. He had looked the other way. But Keon couldn't ignore it anymore. The guilt was eating at him. He couldn't pretend he didn't know what was happening. He couldn't stay silent while innocent girls were being sent into the unknown, erased from existence like they never mattered. So, he did what he could do. He reached out. Keon contacted a local journalist, someone he knew would take the story seriously. He sent an anonymous tip, explaining everything he had seen, everything he had overheard. He didn't give his name. He didn't want to be found. But he couldn't live with the silence anymore. He had to speak out, even if it meant exposing himself to danger. The moment he hit send on that email, Keon felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but it was a small, fleeting relief. He knew that what he was doing could destroy his life, but what was worse, living with the knowledge of what he had allowed to happen, or risking it all to stop it? The journalist, eager to investigate, took the tip seriously and reached out to Keon. They arranged a series of secure meetings, always in dark corners of coffee shops or behind closed doors. Keon's hands shook as he spoke, recounting his role in the operation and the things he had seen. He explained how the girls were brought in, how they were drugged, how they never returned. He described the cold, impersonal way the operation was run. how the girls were nothing more than inventory, moved from one place to another, shipped off like products to an unknown fate. Keon's voice trembled with guilt as he spoke. He had never realized the true nature of the operation until it was too late. He hadn't seen the whole picture until he overheard that conversation. The men who ran the operation didn't care about the girls. To them, they were just part of a system that had been in place for years, one that had operated in the shadows, unnoticed by the world. I didn't know what I was a part of at first, Keon confessed, his voice low and full of regret. But once I heard them talk, I knew. I knew what was happening, and I couldn't stop it. I tried to speak up, but no one listened. I sent an anonymous letter to the police. I emailed human rights groups, but nothing happened. It was like no one cared. They were just girls who had been forgotten. The weight of Keon's guilt was apparent in every word he spoke. He had failed them, just like everyone else. But now, as the investigation ramped up, Keon's testimony would be the catalyst that could change everything. It wasn't just the evidence that mattered, it was his voice, his courage to speak out. That might bring an end to the operation. Keon's story sent shockwaves through the investigation. What had started as a missing persons case had now blossomed into a massive human trafficking operation, one that stretched across state lines and even beyond the country's borders. As the FBI dug into Keon's testimony and began to trace the network of phone numbers, financial transactions, and covert meetings, they realized the full scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't a small-time operation. It was a well-oiled machine, one that had been running for years. But as the investigation progressed, Keon's story left them with more questions than answers. How many girls were involved? Where were they being sent? And who was pulling the strings? The answers weren't easy to find. But Keon's testimony had revealed something no one had been able to see before, the hidden truth that no one wanted to admit. The girls weren't just victims of a criminal operation. They were victims of a system that had allowed them to disappear, unnoticed, forgotten, and silenced. The more the FBI dug into the details of the trafficking ring, the more horrifying the reality became. Keon's testimony had been the first crack in the foundation, a small opening that began to reveal the true scale of the operation. But as the investigation grew, it became clear what they were dealing with was not a small-time criminal ring, but an entire system designed to erase people, especially vulnerable girls, without a trace. The investigation had only begun to scratch the surface. The first breakthrough came when investigators traced a series of burner phones connected to the operation. It started with the phones found at the warehouse, disposable devices that seemed to be used exclusively for the trafficking activities. Each phone, once activated, had been used for only a short period before being discarded, replaced by another one with a fresh set of numbers. These phones were linked to a network of calls that led investigators to an underground network stretching across multiple states. The trail was difficult to follow at first, but as the FBI agents cross-referenced phone records with vehicle movements, the picture started to come together. It was more than just a few vans moving in and out of warehouses. These vehicles, linked through GPS data, had traveled through different cities, taking the girls from one place to another, always on the move, always just under the radar. The trafficking was no longer contained to a single location. It was a multi-state operation, carefully orchestrated to avoid detection, moving girls from one hidden spot to another. Financial connections were the next piece of the puzzle. Investigators dug through the web of shell companies connected to Ethan Kroll's operations, tracing illegal transactions that had been routed through fake businesses. At first, the amounts seemed insignificant, small transactions that didn't raise any alarms. But the more they uncovered, the more disturbing it became. The money was being funneled through these shell companies to offshore accounts in the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. These payments weren't for transportation or services, they were for something far worse. Investigators began to uncover evidence that linked the buyers to countries outside the US, hinting at a global network of clients. These buyers were operating under aliases, their transactions masked by false paperwork, and their identities protected by corrupt local officials. The deeper the FBI dug into these financial records, the clearer it became. This was a well-established operation, one that had been operating internationally without drawing attention. The payment routes followed a pattern: clients in foreign countries making large transfers to offshore accounts, linked back to the very shell companies Kroll had set up to hide his trafficking operation. The money flowed through a network that was as complicated as it was secretive, masking the true scope of the operation. As agents followed the money trail, they found connections to places they hadn't anticipated. Human trafficking was not just confined to small towns or rural areas. Anymore, this operation had expanded, its reach stretching across borders. The girls were no longer just being moved across state lines, they were being sold to buyers across the world. Some were taken to places where they were used for labor, others for far darker purposes. The horror of it all was staggering. These girls weren't just neglected, they had been actively taken. From hospitals, from shelters, from foster care homes, safe places supposed to offer refuge and protection. But instead, these girls were snatched, drugged, and shipped off to places where no one would care enough to look for them. They were chosen because they were invisible, because no one was looking, because they were the easy targets, girls with no families, no resources, no voices loud enough to raise an alarm when they disappeared. Investigators uncovered even more disturbing patterns in the records. In several counties, there had been reports of missing girls who had never been investigated thoroughly. One victim had been reported missing by her foster parents after she was discharged from a mental health facility. Another had vanished after being released from a county hospital. No follow-up investigation, no checks to ensure her safety. Her case had been marked as a voluntary disappearance. Several other girls had been taken straight from homeless shelters, slipping through the cracks as they were never properly documented or reported missing. Some of the girls had been brought in after being arrested or detained for minor offenses. Some had been known runaways, while others were simply seen as troubled teens with nowhere to turn. The system had already written them off. They were cast aside, treated like second-class citizens, and the traffickers knew this. They knew which girls wouldn't have anyone looking for them when they went missing. But as the investigation continued, the tension began to build. The more they uncovered, the more horrifying the reality became. This wasn't just about a few girls disappearing from shelters or foster homes. This was part of a larger, more organized operation that had been running under the radar for years. And as the FBI worked tirelessly to track down the buyers, the network kept growing. Each lead they followed led to more names, more victims, more places where these girls had been sent. It became clear that this was not just a rogue operation. It was a well-oiled system, operating with the full knowledge of corrupt officials who had turned a blind eye for years. Every new discovery added more weight to the growing tension. The deeper they dug, the more they realized the full scope of the operation. It wasn't just about exploiting the girls, it was about controlling them. The girls were transported across states, hidden in plain sight, always just out of reach. They were sold to the highest bidder, shipped off to foreign countries, and used in ways the authorities could barely begin to understand. Each step in the investigation revealed something darker, something more depraved. It wasn't just the scale of the operation that shocked the investigators. It was the cold, calculated manner in which it had been built. The traffickers had managed to avoid detection for so long because they knew how to play the system. They knew which girls were easy targets. They knew how to erase their identities, how to cover their tracks, how to exploit a broken system that allowed them to operate without interference. And yet, even as the investigation continued, there was no sign of the mastermind behind it all. Ethan Kroll had built a system so flawless, so hidden behind layers of corruption, that no one had seen it coming. The more they uncovered, the more the authorities realized that Kroll wasn't just a criminal. He was the architect of an entire operation, one that had been running for years and had become almost impossible to stop. As the FBI zeroed in on the financial connections, the network began to unravel. The more they discovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a trafficking ring. It was a global business. These girls weren't just numbers on a list, they were products, goods to be bought, sold, and traded across borders, and the people behind it were willing to do anything to keep it that way. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and the deeper they dug, the more they realized the true extent of the horror. These girls had been erased, hidden from the world. They were lost not just because they were ignored by the system, but because they had been taken, without anyone even noticing. And now, with the evidence in hand, the FBI was determined to bring the entire operation down, piece by piece, until every person involved was exposed. The trail had led them here, to an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of town, far From the watchful eyes of the public, the warehouse sat in the distance, its crumbling brick walls covered with ivy, its metal doors rusted shut. From the outside, it looked like any other derelict building, forgotten and unused, a relic of a better time. But the FBI knew better now. What had started as a missing persons investigation had unraveled into something far more monstrous. This building, hidden behind layers of neglect, was a key piece in a far larger operation. Federal agents moved quickly, but cautiously, their breath visible in the cold air. The operation was risky. They had no idea what they would find inside. What they did know was that this was the last lead they had. This warehouse was the final piece of the puzzle. As they approached, the eerie quiet of the building weighed heavily on them. The surrounding area was isolated, with only one road leading in and out, and no sign of activity. There were no guards, no surveillance cameras. The place had been abandoned on the surface, but the deeper they got, the more it felt like someone had simply cleared out at the last minute. One agent carefully peeled back a corner of the chain-link fence that surrounded the property. The fence was broken in places, as though it had been torn down or dismantled with little regard. He motioned to the others, signaling them to follow as they slipped inside. The building was larger than they had expected, stretching out in all directions. Inside, the space was cold, stark, and empty except for the cages. It was immediately apparent that this wasn't just a storage facility. The cages lined the walls, rusty and cold, each one large enough to hold a person. Some were open, but others had small, thin blankets inside them, remnants of their use. A few cages still had loose zip ties hanging from the bars, evidence of the restraint once used to hold the victims in place. In the dim light, it was hard to make out details. But the chilling realization hit the agents like a punch to the gut. This was where the girls were kept before they were moved. This was the holding area, the place where they waited, drugged and helpless, before being transported somewhere else. As they moved deeper into the building, more disturbing signs of the operation began to emerge. On the floor, agents found syringes, empty vials, and used medical supplies, all evidence that these girls had been subdued, likely to keep them compliant and unaware of their fate. Some of the agents turned away, the sight too much to bear, but they had to press on. They had come too far. The warehouse was filled with remnants of the operation, each piece a further confirmation of the horror that had taken place here. Plastic restraints, discarded clothing, and several boxes filled with unused supplies. As the agents moved from room to room, their flashlights revealed even more troubling details. Secret compartments built into the walls, hidden storage areas that could have easily been used to keep more girls, or to hide products meant to silence them completely. Everything pointed to one grim conclusion. This wasn't just a hub for transportation. It was a place where the operation had been run from. The walls, cold and bare, seemed to close in around them. The isolation of the building was starting to feel like something more like the operation itself had been carefully planned to remain hidden, operating in plain sight for years, unnoticed and unchecked. The emotional weight of what they were uncovering was starting to take its toll. These girls hadn't just been victims of a random act. They had been systematically selected, transported, and silenced by a machine that had no remorse. One of the agents moved to the back of the warehouse, where they found a small office. It was cramped and bare, with only a desk and a few chairs. The desk was littered with paperwork, but it wasn't business as usual. The documents were coded, cryptic, and covered in red stamps. There were also records of transfers for services, shipments of goods, but no mention of what those goods actually were. One file stood out, the set of receipts for the girls' transport. The addresses listed were fake, and the names were fabricated. There were no records of these girls arriving at the destinations they were supposedly sent to. The more they uncovered, the more they realized this wasn't just the end of a chain. It was only the beginning. This warehouse was part of a network, and the network was vast. And it didn't stop here. But the most disturbing discovery came when agents made their way to the back corner of the warehouse, where they found a walk-in freezer. At first, they assumed it was simply a storage space for perishable items. But when they pried open the door, the cold air that hit them felt too sterile, too clinical. Inside, the freezer was clean to clean. The floor was spotless, the walls wiped down with harsh chemicals. There were no obvious signs of what had been kept there. But something felt wrong. Behind a hidden panel near the floor, agents found remnants of hair, a scrap of torn cloth, and scratches on the metal floor marks. That suggested someone had tried to escape from inside. The freezer hadn't been used to store food. It had been used to hide someone or something. This wasn't just a storage facility. It was a place of fear, a place to silence and isolate. The deeper the investigation went, the more the agents realized this was only the tip of the iceberg. They hadn't uncovered everything. They hadn't even begun to scratch the surface of this operation. The building had been used to warehouse victims, but it had also been used as a place to keep the system running. The real power, the mastermind behind the operation, was still out there, and they hadn't found him yet. Every room they searched, every file they uncovered, only raised more questions. What other warehouses were out there, hidden in plain sight? How many more victims had passed through these walls, and how many were still out there, waiting to be found? As the agents stepped back and surveyed the vastness of the warehouse, the full scale of the operation became apparent. This wasn't just a case of missing persons. This was a global network of trafficking, built on corruption, indifference, and systemic failure, and it was still in motion. The weight of that realization hung heavy in the air. They had uncovered the first true glimpse of a machine designed to exploit the most vulnerable, and they knew there was no turning back. As the investigation advanced, one name began to emerge from the shadows, a name that would soon become synonymous with the entire trafficking operation. Ethan Kroll, a businessman with a spotless public image, had carefully built a criminal empire under the guise of legitimacy. His name appeared again and again in the financial records, in the network of shell companies, and in the scattered links between international buyers and the trafficking ring. Kroll was no ordinary criminal. He had wrapped himself in layers of corporate sophistication, his companies operating on the surface like any other legitimate business. His empire spanned multiple industries, from logistics to shipping, and it was this very network that he had used to hide his true dealings. Behind the pristine facade of his business empire was a far darker operation, one that relied on secrecy, manipulation, and corruption. The deeper the authorities dug into his life, the more chilling the reality became. Kroll wasn't just a businessman. Playing the system, he was its architect. He had used his wealth, his influence, and his connections to ensure that his trafficking operation ran smoothly, unnoticed, and unchecked. Corrupt officials had turned a blind eye to his activities, paid off with the vast amounts of money that flowed from his criminal empire. International crime rings, also under his control, made sure the operation extended beyond the borders of the United States. With the girls being sold to buyers around the world, the connections were undeniable. Kroll's influence stretched far beyond the reaches of local law enforcement and reached into the highest levels of international trafficking networks. His name was whispered in the dark corners of power, where law enforcement and criminals alike had learned to turn a blind eye to his dealings. As the authorities closed in on him, Kroll's carefully crafted empire began to unravel. The people who once worked for him, the men and women who had kept the operation running smoothly, began to turn on him. The web of lies and corruption that Kroll had built was slowly being torn apart, and his fate, once so secure, was beginning to slip through his fingers. The investigation into his network was relentless, and the truth about his criminal empire was coming to light, piece by piece. But the most terrifying part of the discovery was this: Kroll had been pulling the strings all along. He had been the one orchestrating the operation from the very beginning, using his wealth and influence to cover his tracks. His carefully curated life had been nothing more than a smokescreen for his dark, twisted empire. And now, with the walls closing in around him, the man who thought he could never be caught was finally facing the consequences of his actions. As the details of the trafficking operation came to light, the horror of what had happened to the 12 girls began to unfold. But for the families, the revelation was far more than just a shocking crime. It was the crushing realization that their daughters had been discarded, erased, by the very systems that should have been there to protect them. They were the ones left behind, fighting against a system that had ignored them at every turn. Mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers, each of them now found themselves standing at the forefront of a fight they never anticipated. Their outrage was raw, unfiltered, and desperate. These were not just faceless victims. These were their daughters, their family members, each with a name, a story, and a future that had been stolen from them. One mother, Angela, stood on the steps of the Georgia state capitol, her hands trembling as she held up a worn photograph of her daughter, Lacey. The photo was faded, corners torn from the years of being carried from place to place, a mother's constant reminder of the daughter she had lost. She loved science, Angela said, her voice breaking. She wanted to be a nurse, but nobody thought she was worth finding. The tears that followed were not just for the life cut short, but for the silence that had surrounded her disappearance. Lacey had been reported missing 8 months ago, but each time Angela had begged the authorities for answers, she had been told the same thing: she'd come back when she's ready. Another family, in Alabama, shared a similar story. Their daughter, Tamara, had vanished after her shift at a fast food restaurant. Her mother filed a report the day after, but within 72 hours, the case was closed. No follow-up, no questions asked. The family was told Tamara had probably run away, as if that was enough of an explanation. No one had bothered to look deeper. The realization was crushing for the families. Why had no one looked for their daughters? They had screamed for help, filed reports, posted flyers, and knocked on every door they could find. But the system had shrugged them off, dismissing their girls as problems runaways, or women with troubled pasts, or just people who didn't matter. Now, the grief that had once been quietly buried under the weight of silence began to surface, raw and unrelenting. The more they learned, the angrier the families became. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of their daughters, it was the fact that the world hadn't cared. Their children had been invisible to the systems meant to protect them. They had been erased. And now, these families were fighting to make sure their daughters' stories would not be forgotten. As they gathered together, they were no longer just mourning. They were demanding justice. They were standing up as the voices of the voiceless, demanding that the world listen. Their daughters' names would be heard, even in death. The authorities had ignored them, but these families would not be silenced. They would make sure their daughters' stories were told. Their grief had turned to action, and they would not rest until justice was served. The FBI had been tracking Ethan Kroll for months, piecing together the tangled web of his criminal empire. Every lead, every trail of evidence, had pointed to him, but the man had been elusive, slipping through their grasp at every turn. Now, as the net tightened around him, Kroll's days of evading justice were coming to an end. The breakthrough came when federal agents, armed with a warrant, cornered him at his secluded property in the mountains of Montana. For a man who had orchestrated such a vast operation, the capture seemed almost anticlimactic. Kroll didn't fight back. He didn't resist arrest. There was no dramatic escape or final stand. Instead, he sat calmly at a small desk inside a reinforced bunker, surrounded by stacks of cash, fake passports, and encrypted devices. His cold, calculated demeanor gave no hint of the years of suffering he had caused. As Kroll was escorted out of the property, handcuffed and surrounded by armed officers, the weight of the moment hit the investigators. It felt like a victory, the culmination of months of work and sacrifices. But even as they watched him being driven away, there was no sense of closure. The girls, the families, the trauma, none of it could be undone by this one arrest. The grief remained heavy and unyielding. The media erupted in a frenzy as news of Kroll's arrest broke. He was the face of the operation, the man who had masterminded the destruction of countless lives. The families of the victims, their hearts heavy with both relief and lingering pain, waited for the trial. It was to be the moment when justice would finally be served, or so they hoped. In the courtroom, Kroll's trial became a highly publicized spectacle. The families sat in the front rows, their faces a mixture of anger, sorrow, and hope. They listened, some with tears in their eyes, as witnesses took the stand. Survivors spoke of their harrowing experiences, their voices breaking as they recounted the horrors they had endured. Their stories painted a chilling picture of a system that had been designed to erase them. But it was the families who truly stole the show. One mother, holding up a photo of her daughter, stood and shouted through her tears, "She wasn't a problem, she was my baby." Her voice cracked, but the words were loud and clear. The courtroom was silent, except for the sounds of her sobs. Kroll, however, remained stoic. His cold, detached demeanor in the courtroom only added to the emotional impact. He sat through the trial with a chilling indifference, as though the lives he had destroyed meant nothing to him. It was this apathy, this lack of remorse, that made the case even more devastating. As the trial progressed, new details about Kroll's trafficking ring began to emerge. The scope of the operation was even worse than anyone had imagined. Kroll had not only exploited vulnerable girls in the United States, but his reach extended far beyond the borders. The girls were sold to international buyers, trafficked to places no one had suspected. The deeper the investigation went, the more horrifying the truth became. With every revelation, the pain grew. It was no longer just about Kroll. It was about a system that had allowed his empire to thrive for so long. It was about the lives that had been destroyed, while no one paid attention. The families, devastated but determined, continued to speak out, making sure the world heard their voices. No matter how painful the truth was, the trial of Ethan Kroll came to a close, with a verdict that many had hoped for, guilty on all counts. But as the gavel struck, the sense of justice was fleeting. For the families, the victory was hollow. The man who had orchestrated their daughters' disappearances was finally behind bars, but it did little to ease the pain of the years they had spent searching, of the lives that had been stolen from them. While the traffickers were brought to justice, the case revealed a deeper, systemic failure to protect the most vulnerable. These girls were not just statistics. They were people, daughters, sisters, and friends with dreams that were torn away too soon. And the fight for justice, for the countless others still out there, was just beginning.